Imagine the king's hunt, but the hounds are not tracking a deer. Beneath the ancient canopy of the 12th century, silk ribbons are torn not by thorns, but by royal hands. The forest has become a lawless bedroom where noblewomen are the ultimate prey and the trees are the only witnesses to their screams. This was never a noble sport, it was a systematic harvest of souls hidden behind a glittering facade of chivalry that masked a primal and terrifying reality. Within the ancient woods, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, the silence of the 12th century remains undisturbed by the usual sounds of nature. Sunlight struggles to pierce the dense canopy of oak and beech trees, casting long and distorted shadows that dance across the forest floor in a rhythmic display of light and dark. It is a place where the boundaries of the known world dissolve into an emerald twilight, creating a hidden sanctuary for those who seek to escape the rigid gaze of God. The usual songs of birds are silenced by a tension that vibrates through the very roots of the trees, signaling a presence that is both foreign and predatory in its intent. Resting upon a cluster of vibrant green ferns, a discarded silk ribbon shimmers with a ghostly sheen in a rare patch of wandering light. It is not the jagged tear of a hunter's iron arrow or the dark smear of animal blood that marks its delicate surface, but rather a deep stain of fermented wine and crushed beetles. This crimson pigment, used by noblewomen to redden their lips, stands as a silent witness to a presence that does not belong in the untamed wilderness. The fine fabric is out of place among the thorns and soil, a fragment of the royal court cast aside in the heat of a chase that had very little to do with the harvesting of meat or the tracking of a wild boar. In this era, the forest has ceased to be a mere source of sustenance for the kingdom, transforming instead into a sprawling theater for the most dangerous rituals of the nobility. While the common folk see the royal hunt as a display of power or a means to stock the winter larder, a much more predatory game is emerging beneath the leaves. The year 1162 marks a time when the thickets of Winchester and the glades of Aquitaine have become the private chambers of a king. Here, the stone walls of the castle are replaced by walls of thorns, and the strict rules of the palace are traded for the raw and unfiltered instincts of the predator lurking in velvet. Within the cold corridors of the castle, every movement is choreographed by the suffocating rules of feudal etiquette and the watchful, judgmental eyes of the clergy. Marriages are nothing more than political contracts signed in ink and blood, and virtue is a commodity guarded by iron locks and heavy tapestries. However, once the drawbridge is lowered and the horses gallop toward the dark tree lane, those constraints begin to unravel like a frayed hem. The forest offers a lawless freedom where the hierarchy of the court is maintained not by royal decree, but by the physical strength of the pursuer and the desperate speed of the pursued, hidden under layers of fine embroidery. When the king leads his grand retinue into the deepening gloom of the woods, the line between a noble pastime and a calculated act of violence begins to fade into nothingness. The thundering of hooves is not always directed toward the scent of a stag, but often toward the fluttering silk skirts of a lady-in-waiting who has been isolated from her companions. This is a hunt where the arrows are merely metaphors for a sharper and more intimate conquest, and the prize is not a trophy for the wall, but the total surrender of a human soul. The greenery provides a screen for actions that would be whispered as scandals in the city, yet here they are celebrated as sports. The sensory experience of the woods is an accomplice to these deeds, swallowing the cries of the startled and the laughter of the emboldened without leaving a trace. The smell of horses, sweat, and expensive perfume mingles with the earthy aroma of the undergrowth, creating a heady intoxication that clouds the judgment of even the most pious knights. Far from the echoing cathedrals and the stern sermons of the bishops, the nobility feels a strange sense of total immunity. In this realm of bark and leaf, the only authority that matters is the will of the monarch, whose word is absolute law and whose desires are as irresistible as the tides crashing against the jagged shore. To be invited to a royal hunt in the late 12th century is both a high honor and a terrifying sentence for the women who populate the inner circles of the court. They are expected to ride alongside the men, draped in heavy fabrics and intricate layers that hinder their escape should the game turn inward upon them. Each rustle of the dry leaves could herald the arrival of a suitor who does not seek consent, but rather an opportunity to exert the dominance that the social order demands. The ladies become the ultimate quarry, their beauty a beacon that draws the hunters deeper into the thickets where no servant would ever dare to follow their master into the darkness. There is a frantic and desperate energy to these excursions, a wildness born from the crushing weight of their public lives and the expectations of their lineage. The young lords and the king himself seek a return to something primal, stripping away the thin veneer of civilization to reveal the predatory nature that lurks beneath the surface. They do not see themselves as villains, but as masters of their vast domain, exercising a divine right that extends over the bodies of their subjects as surely as it does over their lands. This is the dark heart of the court, where the concept of love is twisted into a pursuit of flesh and the thrill of the chase is the ultimate power. The ancient trees stand as silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to grasp at the passing riders and their silken banners. They have seen centuries of blood spilled for the sake of survival, but this new era of courtly sport brings a different kind of stain to their deep roots. The silence of the woods is heavy with the weight of unrecorded secrets, each hollow trunk and hidden glade potentially harboring the aftermath of a royal whim. The very air seems to vibrate with the tension of the hunt, a tangible force that grips the hearts of the participants, driving them further into the emerald labyrinth where the rules of the world are dead. As the sun dips lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, the true nature of the day's activities becomes painfully apparent. The hunters will eventually return to the castle with empty bags or a single mangled carcass, but their eyes will glint with a satisfaction that has nothing to do with the larder. The forest will remain, holding within its depths the discarded ribbons, the broken branches, and the echoes of a drama that will never be recorded in the official chronicles. It was here that the hunt for love became a hunt for control, leaving a legacy of shadows that would haunt the corridors of history for many years to come. The velvet and brocade worn by the participants serve as a mask for the animal instincts that drive the cavalcade deeper into the brush. As the horses lather and the riders grow weary, the psychological mask of the courtly lover drops, revealing the face of a man who views the world as his counting house and the people in it as his coin. There is no mercy in the forest, only the relentless drive of the chase and the eventual cornering of the prey. The 12th century would be remembered for its cathedrals and its crusades, but the true history was written in the dirt and the blood of these private forests, far from the light of the sun and the reach of the law. Every snap of a twig and every rustle of the canopy serves as a reminder that in this green cathedral, the predator is king and the prey has no voice to scream for help. The intricate dances of the ballroom are forgotten in favor of the lunging stride of a destrier and the iron grip of a hand on a rein. Here, the noble families of Europe were forged not just in battle, but in the silence of the woods, where the bloodlines of kings were mixed with the tears of those who had no choice but to endure. The cycle of the hunt is eternal, a dark ritual that repeats with every generation that dares to step beneath the shadow of the ancient, unblinking oaks of the realm. Ultimately, the forest of the 12th century is a landscape of contradictions, a place of immense beauty that hides unspeakable acts of cruelty. The nobility returns to their stone halls at dusk, washing the mud from their boots and the wine from their lips, appearing once again as the paragons of Christian virtue. Yet the trees remember the ribbon on the fern, the laughter in the dark, and the struggle of those who were hunted in the name of love. The history of this era is not found in the grand declarations of state, but in the quiet desperation of the woods, where the arrows of desire were often tools of a much more literal and devastating conquest of the weak. The court of King Henry II was a masterpiece of cold and calculating architecture, where the stone walls of Westminster seemed to lean inward to catch the faintest whisper of treason. Every noble who walked the echoing halls was a prisoner of a complex system of etiquette that dictated everything from the depth of a bow to the length of a gaze. This was a world built on the rigid foundations of feudal law, where the pursuit of power was the only recognized occupation, and the human heart was considered a dangerous liability in the Game of Thrones. The air was perpetually thick with the scent of burning beeswax and the metallic tang of polished iron, creating an atmosphere of constant and suffocating vigilance. Within this gilded cage, the institution of marriage served as the primary currency for expanding the borders of the vast Plantagenet empire. In the year 1154, the union of kings and queens was less about affection and more about the consolidation of territories from the Scottish border to the warm hills of the Pyrenees. Young women were traded like pieces of land, their lives destined to be spent in cold marital beds with men they barely knew, all for the sake of a strategic alliance or a disputed inheritance. These political contracts left no room for the turbulent passions that boiled beneath the surface of the medieval aristocracy, creating a pressurized environment that demanded a violent release. The court was a dense web of intrigue where every spoken word was weighed on invisible scales, and every gesture could be interpreted as a sign of favor or a harbinger of doom. Courtiers lived in a state of perpetual performance, hiding their true intentions behind masks of pious devotion and loyalty. The pressure to remain perfect in the eyes of the king was exhausting, leading to a desperate need for a space where the rules of the city did not apply. Under the surface of this ordered society, a restlessness was growing, a hunger for something raw and unscripted that the grey stones of the palace could never provide for the restless spirit of the monarch. King Henry II himself was a man of uncontrollable energy, a ruler who famously could not sit still even during the most solemn of church services. His legs were bowed from a lifetime in the saddle, and his hands were calloused by the grip of a sword and the reins of a horse. This king did not find peace in the quiet contemplation of scrolls or the soft music of the lute. He craved the chaos of the open field and the adrenaline of the chase. His temperament was a reflection of the age itself, a blend of sophisticated law-giving and primal aggression that required a constant outlet to prevent the royal mind from turning inward with destructive force. The royal hunt was the only legitimate theater where this surging energy could be channeled without tearing the social fabric of the kingdom apart. By the middle of the 12th century, the Great Hunt had evolved from a simple quest for venison into a complex and highly ritualized social event that consumed vast amounts of wealth and time. It was the only time when the king and his followers could shed the suffocating robes of the state and engage in a pursuit that was both physically demanding and spiritually liberating. However, beneath the surface of this noble tradition, a darker purpose began to take root in the shadows of the ancient English forests. As the king traveled through his domains, particularly in the sprawling woods of Winchester or the deep green hearts of Aquitaine, the focus of the hunt began to shift away from the animal kingdom. The master of the hounds and the royal equerries began to receive instructions that went beyond the tracking of a 10-point stag. The preparations for these excursions became elaborate ceremonies where the guest lists were scrutinized with a level of detail usually reserved for diplomatic summits. It was during this period that the hunt acquired its second, more sinister meaning, becoming a vehicle for a very different kind of conquest that ignored the boundaries of marriage. The composition of the hunting party was no longer limited to the king's knights and his bravest soldiers. Increasingly, the lists of participants were filled with the names of young ladies-in-waiting and the beautiful, often neglected wives of the king's most prominent vassals. These women were commanded to attend the hunt under the guise of courtly inclusion, but their presence was not intended for the thrill of the chase across the open meadows. They were brought along to serve as the living prizes in a game of shadow and light, where the dense undergrowth of the forest provided the privacy that the crowded corridors of the castle could never afford. The royal, or huntsmen, were trained to identify more than just the tracks of a deer. They became silent accomplices in the isolation of these women from their protective entourages. A plan would be set in motion weeks in advance, identifying specific glades and hidden valleys where a lady could be separated from the main body of the hunt. These men, bound by oaths of silence and loyalty to the king alone, orchestrated the movements of dozens of riders to ensure that at the crucial moment, the monarch or a favored nobleman would find himself alone with his chosen target. The forest was being mapped out not for sport, but for the systematic pursuit of human flesh. When the morning of the hunt arrived, the castle courtyards erupted in a symphony of barking dogs, neighing stallions, and the sharp, clear notes of the hunting horns. To an outside observer, it was a display of peak chivalry and vibrant life, with colorful banners snapping in the wind and the glint of sun on polished leather. But for the women being helped into their saddles, the spectacle was often a source of profound dread. They knew that once they crossed the threshold of the forest, the protection of their families and the social norms of the court would vanish, replaced by the unpredictable whims of men who considered themselves gods among the trees. The transition from the open fields into the dark embrace of the woods marked the beginning of the transformation. As the canopy closed overhead, the bright light of day was replaced by a flickering, uncertain green glow that seemed to swallow the voices of the riders. The hierarchy of the court began to distort, and the rigid manners of the table were forgotten in the excitement of the movement. The king would often lead the charge, his eyes scanning the treeline not for the movement of a beast, but for the flash of a silk sleeve or the golden hair of a girl who had been steered toward a prearranged dead end by the skillful beaters. This was the birth of the secret cult of the love hunt, where the vocabulary of the chase was used to mask the reality of what was occurring in the thickets. To run a lady to ground became a common phrase among the king's inner circle, a joke shared over flagons of wine while the women they spoke of sat nearby in forced silence. The forest was no longer a natural resource, it was a sprawling, roofless bedroom where the laws of the church were suspended by the sheer distance from the nearest priest. In the 12th century, the forest was a sovereign territory where the king's pleasure was the only gospel that mattered to the men in his service. The isolation of the woods provided the perfect cover for these encounters, as the sounds of the struggle were easily muffled by the wind in the leaves and the distant calls of the hunters. There were no witnesses in the deep brush, and no one would dare to question the monarch if a lady returned to the camp with a torn gown and eyes filled with tears. The power of the king was so absolute that even the most powerful lords would look away if it was their own daughter or wife who was the object of the royal attention. To protest was to risk everything, for in the woods, the king was not just a judge, but a force of nature. These outings were organized with a terrifying efficiency that mimicked the tactics of war. The king used the geography of the land to his advantage, using the hills and streams of the English countryside to split the party into smaller, more vulnerable groups. It was a strategy of fragmentation, where the strength of numbers was traded for the vulnerability of the individual. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent, the confusion of the hunt reached its peak, allowing for hours of unaccounted time where the dark deeds of the elite could be carried out with complete and total impunity. The psychological impact on the court was one of quiet terror masked by the appearance of gaiety. The women learned to navigate this landscape with a desperate caution, trying to stay close to one another while knowing that the king's men would eventually find a way to break their ranks. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies were considered part of the royal forest, as much a property of the crown as the timber in the trees or the fish in the streams. This realization created a culture of submission that was reinforced every time the hunting horns sounded from the castle walls, signaling another day of predatory sport. Even the most famous women of the era, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, had to navigate this world of masculine aggression. While she herself was a woman of immense power, she saw how the men around her, including her husband Henry, used the hunt as a tool of dominance. The forest was a place where she could exercise her own freedom, but it was also a place where she saw the limits of her influence over the king's darker impulses. The courtly love she patronized in her songs and poems was often a thin veil designed to beautify a reality that was far more brutal and less romantic than the troubadours would ever dare to admit in their verses. By the end of the 12th century, the reputation of the royal hunt had become a whispered scandal that reached even the ears of the distant pope in Rome. Yet, the king's grip on his forests remained unshakable, as he continued to use these excursions to assert his dominance over his subjects in the most intimate way possible. The hunt was not just an escape from the court, it was a reinforcement of the king's role as the ultimate predator in his kingdom. The deer may have been the official target, but it was the souls and bodies of the courtiers that were truly harvested in the name of the crown's insatiable and unchecked desires. As night finally fell and the hunting party returned to the safety of the castle, the masks were carefully placed back over the faces of the weary participants. The king would take his place at the head of the banquet table, laughing and joking as if the day had been nothing more than a simple exercise in the fresh air. But the silence of the women at the table told a different story, a narrative of fear and powerlessness that would be passed down through the generations in hushed tones. The hunt for love had claimed its latest victims, and the forest waited in the darkness, ready to hide the secrets of the next royal outing. The legacy of these hunts would eventually be felt in the birth of countless illegitimate children, whose origins were traced back to a specific clearing or a certain rainy afternoon in the woods of the king. These bastards were the living evidence of a system that viewed the female population of the court as a resource to be exploited at will. The 11th and 12th centuries were a time of great architectural and legal progress, but in the heart of the woods, the progress was non-existent. There, the ancient rules of the predator and the prey remained the only truth, and the king's hunt was the ultimate expression of that timeless and cruel reality. Every stone in the castle of Winchester and every tree in the forests of Aquitaine holds a piece of this hidden history, a chronicle of a time when the hunt was a weapon of the powerful against the weak. The numbers of those affected were never recorded in the official ledgers of the state, for the pain of a nameless lady-in-waiting was of no consequence to the chroniclers of the king's reign. Yet, the emotional resonance of these events shaped the character of the medieval court, creating a legacy of distrust and hidden agendas that would influence the course of history for centuries to come, long after the last hunting horn had faded into the silence. The cultural landscape of the 1170s was defined by a haunting duality that permeated every aspect of noble life, from the songs of the traveling poets to the sharpening of a hunter's steel. In the sunlight of the great halls, the imagery of the arrow was used as a delicate metaphor for the sudden and overwhelming strike of passion, a divine wound delivered by a blind god to the unsuspecting heart of a lover. However, this poetic artifice served as a shimmering veil for a far more sinister reality where the flight of a bolt from a crossbow was an instrument of terror and absolute coercion. The same symbol that inspired the lyrical verses of a troubadour was simultaneously used to track and trap those who had no desire to be found. By the middle of the 12th century, the vocabulary of the royal court had become dangerously entangled with the technical jargon of the wilderness, creating a linguistic trap for the unwary. To the uninitiated, the talk of the chase seemed like a simple discussion of sport, but for the courtiers of the Plantagenet era, every term held a secondary, predatory meaning that signaled a specific intent. The language used to describe the tracking of a wild beast was seamlessly applied to the pursuit of women, turning the art of seduction into a calculated military maneuver. This fusion of terms allowed the most powerful men in the kingdom to discuss their prey in the open, using a code that was as impenetrable as it was cruel. In the year 1174, the phrase to run down a doe had lost its literal connection to the animal kingdom, evolving into a specific tactical instruction for the isolation of a lady from her protective circle. This process began with the careful observation of the target within the safety of the castle, noting her habits and her preferred companions. The forest was then used as the ultimate tool of fragmentation, where the dense undergrowth and the confusing network of trails allowed the hunters to systematically peel away the layers of a woman's social defense. What appeared to be a chaotic chase was, in truth, a highly choreographed operation designed to leave the victim alone in the deep brush. The legendary figure of Eleanor of Aquitaine sat at the very center of this complex web, embodying the tension between the ideal of courtly love and the brutal reality of the royal forest. As a queen who had presided over the famed courts of love, she had fostered an environment where the nuances of affection were debated with the same intensity as theological doctrines. She encouraged the idea that a woman should be the sovereign of her own heart, protected by the codes of chivalry and the devotion of her knights. Yet, even as she sat on her throne of influence, she was acutely aware that her power stopped abruptly at the edge of the ancient treeline, where the rules of men took a different form. Eleanor understood the rules of the game better than anyone, recognizing that the troubadours she patronized were often creating a fantasy to mask the harshness of the world they lived in. While she presided over literary disputes about the nature of a lover's gaze, her husband and his knights were transforming the act of hunting into a systematic exercise in dominance. The Queen of Aquitaine saw the young girls of her household depart for the woods with a mix of resignation and hidden sorrow, knowing that the green halls of the forest were governed by a law that ignored the sophisticated decrees of her courts. She was a witness to the erosion of the very dignity she sought to uphold. When the massive iron gates of the castle creaked open and the cavalcade of riders vanished into the shadows of the oaks, the atmosphere changed from one of festive celebration to one of predatory focus. The transition was immediate and visceral, as the soft music of the banquet hall was replaced by the harsh, rhythmic thud of hooves on damp earth. In this environment, the social status of a woman, whether she was a high-born duchess or a humble lady-in-waiting, offered no protection against the will of a sovereign who had decided to satisfy his hunger. The forest acted as a great equalizer, stripping away the protections of rank and leaving only the fundamental roles of the hunter and the hunted. The isolation of a victim within the thousands of acres of the royal domain was a feat of terrifying precision, managed by the king's most trusted beaters and scouts. These men would drive the main body of the hunt in one direction, using noise and the movement of the hounds to create a wall of sound that obscured the movements of the smaller groups. A lady who found herself lagging behind or led astray by a helpful guide would soon find that the voices of her friends were fading into the distance, replaced by the heavy silence of the deep woods. It was in these moments of realization that the true nature of the hunt became apparent, as the landscape itself seemed to conspire in her entrapment. As the target was funneled into a preselected glade, the sovereign would emerge from the shadows, not as a king seeking a stag, but as a man exercising a perceived right to possess whatever his eyes fell upon. There was no room for the elegant dialogues of the courts of love in these damp, dark places where the scent of rotting leaves and the cold breath of the forest hung in the air. The king's pursuit was not driven by the longing described in poetry, but by a raw and animalistic desire to assert his control over the very lives of those in his service. The arrow of passion was revealed to be a weapon of steel, pointed directly at the heart of anyone who dared to resist. The psychological toll of these encounters was exacerbated by the absolute silence that followed them, a code of omerta that bound the entire nobility together in a shared secret. To speak of what occurred in the green halls was to challenge the foundation of the king's authority, an act of treason that could lead to the ruin of an entire family. Consequently, the victims returned to the light of the court with their heads bowed, forced to endure the celebratory atmosphere of a successful hunt while bearing the invisible scars of a profound violation. The contrast between the festive music of the evening and the silent trauma of the afternoon was the defining characteristic of the 12th century experience. Even the most powerful vassals found themselves paralyzed by the realization that their own daughters and wives were considered legitimate targets for the royal sport. In the year 1176, the tension within the court reached a boiling point as more and more noble houses saw their lineages tainted by the shadows of the forest. Yet, the king's control over the land was so absolute that any attempt at protest was stifled before it could even be whispered. The forest was not just a place for the king to hunt animals, it was a psychological weapon used to remind every person in the kingdom that their most intimate boundaries could be breached at the whim of the crown. The imagery of the hunt was so pervasive that it even influenced the way children were raised and educated within the royal household, normalizing the idea of the woman as a prize to be captured. Young boys were taught that the pursuit of a deer and the pursuit of a lady required the same set of skills, patience, tracking, and the eventual application of force. This cultural indoctrination ensured that the cycle of the love hunt would continue long after the current monarch had passed into the annals of history. The forest was a classroom of cruelty, where the next generation of leaders learned that the world was divided into those who held the bow and those who felt the arrow. Eleanor of Aquitaine watched this process with an increasing sense of futility, her own influence waning as the years of her marriage to Henry II grew more bitter. She saw the very language of her homeland, the beautiful tongue of the troubadours, being weaponized and distorted until it became a mockery of itself. The courts she had built were like islands of light in a sea of encroaching darkness, and she knew that the shadows of the trees were ultimately more powerful than the silk of her tapestries. Her inability to protect the women of her circle was a constant reminder of the limits of her crown and the predatory nature of the men who surrounded her. As the sun set on the 11th century and the 12th century progressed toward its final decades, the green halls of the forest remained a place of mystery and terror for many. The secret paths and hidden clearings held the echoes of 1,000 desperate struggles that would never be acknowledged by the chroniclers or the law. The silence of the woods was the silence of the oppressed, a heavy and suffocating weight that balanced the scales against the loud and boisterous celebrations of the royal hunt. Every tree was a witness, and every leaf held a memory of a time when the boundary between a noble sport and a brutal crime was as thin as a single blade of grass. The sovereign's hunger for the chase was never truly satisfied, for it was not about the meat or the trophy, but about the thrill of the total collapse of another's will. The forest provided the perfect environment for this exercise of absolute power, offering a space where the complexities of human society were stripped away to reveal the raw hierarchy of the natural world. In the eyes of the king, the forest was his church, his courtroom, and his bedroom, and the people he led into its depths were merely the subjects of his many kingdoms of desire. The hunt was the ultimate expression of his soul, a dark and unrelenting pursuit of a dominance that knew no end. Ultimately, the symbolism of the 12th century was a mirror of its soul, beautiful on the surface, but hollow and dangerous at its core. The arrows that flew through the air of the English and French forests were more than just projectiles, they were the physical manifestation of a culture that valued the thrill of the kill over the sanctity of the person. The poets would continue to write their verses, and the troubadours would continue to sing their songs, but those who had lived through the reality of the hunt knew the truth. They knew that behind every beautiful word was a shadow, and behind every shadow was a hunter waiting for the moment to strike. The legacy of the 1170s was one of profound contradiction, a time when the highest ideals of human civilization were practiced alongside the most primitive and animalistic of behaviors. The forest remained the silent partner in this drama, providing the walls for the green halls and the floor for the hidden chambers of the king. As the riders emerged from the trees at the end of each day, they brought with them a darkness that would eventually consume the very structures of power they sought to maintain. The hunt for love was a hunt for the soul of the kingdom, and the price of that pursuit was paid in the blood and tears of those who could not escape. Even as the decade drew to a close and the political map of Europe began to shift, the ritual of the forest remained a constant, a dark thread woven into the fabric of the aristocracy. The stories of the love hunt were passed down in whispers, becoming part of the folklore of the nobility, a cautionary tale for those who dared to believe in the illusions of the court. The green halls waited for the next season, for the next king, and for the next generation of prey, their leaves rustling with the secrets of the past and the promises of a future that would remain just as predatory as the world that had come before it. The final irony of the era was that the very culture of chivalry that was supposed to protect the weak was the same culture that provided the tools for their exploitation. The knight who pledged his life to a lady's service in the morning was the same man who might lead her into an ambush in the afternoon. This fragmentation of the moral self was the true achievement of the 12th century court, a psychological state that allowed for the coexistence of extreme piety and extreme cruelty. The forest was the only place where these two halves could meet, creating a world of emerald shadows where anything was possible and nothing was forbidden. As the chapter of this specific era comes to a close, the image of the discarded silk ribbon on the forest floor remains the most potent symbol of the time. It is a fragment of a world that tried to be elegant, left behind in a place that knew only the raw truth of survival. The ribbon, like the women who wore it, was a casualty of a hunt that never truly ended, a silent reminder that in the woods of the 12th century, there was no such thing as a fair game. The sovereign's will was a force that could not be checked, and the forest was the grandest stage for a drama that would haunt the collective memory of the world for centuries. The dust of the dry road settles as the iron-studded gates of the castle groan shut, signaling the end of the seasonal festivities. For the men, the memory of the hunt is a series of boasts and shared flagons of ale, a story to be told with increasing bravado. But for a select few among the women, the return brings a silence heavier than the stone foundations. They move through the halls like specters, their eyes downcast and their smiles practiced, hiding the realization that the forest has left an unwanted mark. The shadows of the trees seem to cling to their gowns, a reminder of the chase that ended not in a kill, but in a quiet, devastating transformation of their entire future. As the weeks pass, the clandestine reality of the forest begins to manifest in a way that no silk corset can hide. The courtly life continues with its dances and its prayers, but for the victim of the royal hunt, the world becomes a narrow corridor of dread. She watches the moon wax and wane with a terror that is shared only in the darkest corners of the ladies' chambers. The physical burden of the king's whim grows with every passing day, a living parasite that consumes her dignity and her standing in the social hierarchy. Every morning brings a new struggle to maintain the facade of health while the body betrays the secret that was supposed to remain buried in the leaves. The first step in the systematic erasure of this shame is the invention of a mysterious and lingering illness. The court physicians, often in the pay of the crown or bound by their own need for survival, are quick to provide the necessary diagnosis. A sudden fever, a weakness of the humors, or a need for a specific spiritual cleansing becomes the official narrative whispered among the courtiers. It is a polite fiction that everyone chooses to believe because the truth is too dangerous to acknowledge. The lady is advised to seek the healing air of a distant estate or the quiet contemplation of a holy site, far from the prying eyes of those who would calculate the months. The departure is always a somber and hurried affair, often occurring under the cover of a gray dawn or a misty evening. There are no grand farewells or poetic promises of return, only the rattle of a carriage and the heavy hearts of those inside. The destination is almost always a remote monastery or a hidden convent, places where the walls are thick and the tongues are supposedly tied by sacred vows. These institutions, ostensibly dedicated to the service of God, serve as the kingdom's secret warehouses for the consequences of royal excess. They are the transition zones where a noble life is briefly suspended and a secret life is brought into the cold light of day. The journey to these distant sanctuaries is a grueling trek across broken paths and through desolate landscapes that mirror the internal state of the traveler. Every jolt of the carriage is a reminder of the physical and emotional trauma that began under the canopy of the woods. The woman is stripped of her finery and her titles as she travels further from the center of power, becoming a nameless ward of the church. She is no longer a player in the game of courtly love, but a piece of evidence that must be carefully managed until it can be discarded. The rolling hills and deep valleys of the countryside provide a vast and uncaring backdrop to her unfolding tragedy. Upon arrival at the monastery, the high stone walls and the rhythmic tolling of the bells create a new kind of prison. The air inside is cold and tastes of incense and ancient dust, a sharp contrast to the vibrant and terrifying life of the royal forest. Here, the noblewoman is placed in a cell that is stripped of all luxury, a space designed for penance rather than recovery. The nuns who attend her move with a practiced and silent efficiency, their eyes reflecting a knowledge that they never voice. They have seen many such guests before, and they know that their duty is not just to the body, but to the preservation of a secret that protects the crown. The months of isolation are a slow and agonizing descent into a different kind of darkness. From the window of her cell, the lady watches the seasons change, seeing the vibrant greens of the forest turn to the brittle browns of autumn and finally the stark whites of winter. Each day is marked by the chanting of psalms and the cold reality of her growing stomach, a physical weight that she cannot escape. The memories of the hunt, the laughter of the drunken lords, and the sound of the crashing brush haunt her dreams. In the silence of the holy house, the violence of the forest seems even louder, a discordant scream that no prayer can ever truly silence. The labor itself is a solitary battle fought in the flickering light of a single tallow candle, far from the comfort of family or the skill of a royal midwife. There are no songs to welcome this child, only the muffled cries of the mother and the stern whispers of the attending sisters. The baby is born into a world that does not want it, a living proof of a moment that the king has likely already forgotten. The child's first breath is taken in a room that smells of damp stone and medicinal herbs, a far cry from the silk-lined cradles of the legitimate heirs. This infant is a trophy of a different sort, a prize that carries the weight of a lifelong exile. The immediate fate of the child is decided not by the mother, but by the agents of the crown who arrive with the same secrecy that marked the lady's departure. Often, the newborn is whisked away before the mother can even hold it, handed over to wet nurses in distant villages or fostered in the homes of loyal but minor servants. The child becomes a ghost in the landscape, a person whose lineage is a dangerous secret and whose very existence is a threat to the stability of the noble house. For the king, the child is a loose end to be tied. For the mother, the child is a phantom limb, a part of her that has been amputated and cast into the shadows. In the archives of the church and the private ledgers of the royal treasurers, these events leave behind only the most subtle of traces. One might find an unexplained donation to a specific convent or a sudden pension granted to a nameless orphan in a remote province. These financial transactions are the cold and transactional reality of the hunt's aftermath. They are the price of silence, the gold that is supposed to buy the erasure of a life. Thousands of such records exist, silent witnesses to the hundreds of women whose lives were diverted into these temporary refuges of stone and shadow. The numbers tell a story of a systematic exploitation that was part of the very machinery of the state. When the time finally comes for the lady to return to the court, she must perform the final and most difficult act of the drama. She must step back into the world of velvet and wine as if the last 9 months had never happened. The physical traces of the birth are hidden under the same gowns that once failed to protect her. She is greeted with hollow smiles and polite inquiries about her health, all while knowing that everyone in the room is participating in the same grand deception. The shame of the forest has been processed through the monastery and the treasury, leaving her a hollow shell of her former self, forever marked by the knowledge of what lies hidden. The psychological impact of this return is a slow poison that seeps into every interaction and every social obligation. The lady sees the king at the head of the table, perhaps already eyeing the next young girl to join the hunt, and she must remain silent. The gold that was used to pay for her seclusion and the child's upkeep sits in the coffers like a curse, a constant reminder that her dignity was sold to maintain the prestige of the crown. Every time she hears the sound of a hunting horn, she is transported back to the damp earth and the terrifying chase, a nightmare that repeats in the silence of her own mind long after the physical wounds have healed. The children born of these encounters grow up in a world of half-truths, often sensing that they do not truly belong to the families that raised them. Some of them, through luck or a lingering sense of royal duty, find their way back to the edges of the court as bastards of the realm. They are the living evidence of the forest's secrets, their faces often bearing the recognizable features of the Plantagenet line. Yet they are always outsiders, reminded by their very presence that they were the unintended byproducts of a game played by men who viewed the world as their hunting ground. Their lives are the long shadows cast by the trees of the 12th century. The concept of false piety is the ultimate shield for this system of abuse, allowing the perpetrators to move through the world as paragons of Christian virtue. The king who hunts women in the woods is the same man who builds cathedrals and goes on pilgrimage to atone for his sins. This duality is not seen as a contradiction, but as a necessary balance in a world where power and faith are inextricably linked. The monastery, intended to be a place of healing and holiness, becomes an essential gear in the mechanism of royal desire, providing the physical space where the consequences of sin can be managed and eventually made to disappear. The ultimate tragedy is that this cycle was not an exception, but a defining feature of the era's social fabric. The lives of hundreds of women were consumed by the demands of the royal hunt, their personal histories interrupted and rewritten to serve the needs of the dynasty. The forest was not just a place of trees and animals, it was a factory of trauma that produced a steady stream of secrets and shattered identities. The beauty of the medieval court, with its music and its poetry, was built upon these forgotten foundations of pain and silence. Each stone in the castle walls could tell a story of a woman whose voice was lost in the cold winds of the monastic cell. As the years roll into the next century, the memories of these specific hunts may fade, but the system of secrecy remains firmly in place. The forest continues to be a sovereign territory where the king's will is absolute, and the monasteries continue to receive their nameless guests. The story of the love hunt is a narrative of power that repeats itself with a chilling regularity, a testament to the enduring nature of human greed and the fragility of those who are caught in its path. The trophies of these excursions are not the antlers on the wall, but the broken lives and the silenced voices of those who were never meant to be heard. The gold of the crown, no matter how much is spent, can never truly wash away the stain of the forest or the memory of the child left behind. The trauma is visceral and permanent, a weight that the victims carry into their graves, taking their secrets with them. In the end, the history of the 12th century is incomplete without these chapters of darkness, for they reveal the true cost of the grand spectacles that the world so admires. The hunt for love was a hunt for the very soul of the subjects, a relentless pursuit that left the kingdom forever changed and the hearts of its women forever shadowed by the ancient trees. The high, vaulted arches of the great cathedrals of England and France echoed with the thunderous denunciations of the clergy, who watched the royal hunting parties with a mixture of pious horror and mounting political frustration. From the safety of their stone pulpits, bishops and archbishops looked out upon a nobility that seemed increasingly untethered from the moral constraints of the Holy Mother Church. In the year 1180, the tension between the spiritual authority of Rome and the temporal whims of the Plantagenet crown reached a simmering point, as the forest became a symbolic battlefield where the laws of God were openly flouted under the green canopy. The clergy observed that while the king and his court made the required gestures of devotion during the morning mass, their hearts were already galloping toward the dark tree-line where the reach of the priest significantly weakened. To the medieval churchman, the deep woods were more than just a source of timber or game, they were a wild and untamed wilderness that bypassed the structured order of civilization. The forest was viewed as a chaotic realm where the devil walked more freely than in the paved streets of the city, and where the animal nature of man was encouraged to feast upon the weaknesses of the soul without the immediate fear of penance. Despite the growing anger of the papacy, the power of the monarch within the boundaries of the royal forest was absolute and legally unassailable. Under the draconian codes known as the Forest Law, which had been expanded and refined since the time of the Norman conquest, these vast territories were considered the personal and private property of the crown. Inside these wooded zones, the common laws of the land and the jurisdiction of the public courts simply ceased to exist. The king was the sole legislator, the only judge, and the ultimate executioner of justice, creating a legal void where the rights of the subjects were entirely dependent on the royal mood. This legal isolation meant that any crime committed beneath the oaks and elms of the king's domain was effectively invisible to the eyes of the state and the church alike. No sheriff could enter these lands to arrest a nobleman for a violation of honor, and Northwest Ecclesiastical Court could easily gather the evidence needed to prosecute a royal favorite for his excesses. The forest was a sovereign sanctuary for the powerful, a place where the king could grant his companions the freedom to indulge in their darkest impulses without the risk of public scandal or legal retribution. This immunity turned the hunt into a dangerous invitation to lawlessness. By the year 1184, learned monks and scholarly priests began to produce elaborate treatises on the inherent sinfulness of these excursions, explicitly labeling the deep woods as the porch of hell or the vestibule of perdition. They wrote in cramped, angry script about the dangers of the flesh and the way that the natural world served as a catalyst for the most primitive of human lusts. These documents described the forest as a place where the shadows hid the face of God, allowing men to act like the beasts they hunted. Yet, the ink of the scholars proved no match for the steel of the hunters and the insatiable thirst for dominion. The monarchs of the late 12th century understood that their control over the forest was a potent political weapon that could be used to manipulate the loyalty of their vassals. The hunt evolved from a simple pastime into a sophisticated system of social control and psychological leverage. A king could reward a particularly loyal knight by granting him the singular honor of riding in the inner circle during a seasonal hunt, a gesture that often included the implicit permission to pursue a specific lady of the court. Access to the royal woods became a form of currency, a gift of flesh and freedom that bound the nobility to the crown through shared secrets. In this twisted economy of favors, the forest glades were treated like private banquet halls where the king played the role of the ultimate host. To be allowed to hunt alongside the sovereign was to be invited into a pact of mutual indulgence, where the lines of morality were blurred for the sake of political cohesion. The king used the shared thrill of the chase to forge a brotherhood of predators, ensuring that his men were as complicit in his desires as they were in his wars. This bond of silence was stronger than any oath of fealty, as it was built on the shared knowledge of deeds that could never be spoken of in the light of day. Conversely, the forest served as a devastating instrument of punishment for those who dared to cross the royal wool or fail in their duties to the crown. A nobleman who had fallen out of favor might find himself invited on a hunt where he was forced to watch as his daughter or his wife was targeted for pursuit by the king's favorites. This was a form of political castration, a public humiliation carried out in the private theater of the woods where the victim had no recourse and no witness. The dishonor visited upon a family during such an outing could break the spirit of even the most defiant vassal, serving as a warning to all who might consider rebellion. The systematic dishonoring of a rival's lineage was a calculated maneuver that used the biology of the hunt to settle the scores of the court. In the year 1192, the forest was being used to effectively neutralize political opponents by tainting their bloodlines and destroying their social standing. A daughter returned from the woods with a shattered reputation was a liability that could prevent a rival house from forming powerful marital alliances in the future. The trees, which had stood for centuries as silent observers of the natural world, now became the cold accomplices in the destruction of human dignity and the erasure of noble honor. This atmosphere of fear and opportunity turned the royal hunting parties into a tense and volatile environment where every participant was constantly measuring the political winds. The ladies of the court learned to read the nuances of the king's gaze with a desperate intensity, knowing that a single smile from the monarch toward a specific knight could signal the beginning of their own personal nightmare. The forest was no longer a place of escape, it was a high-stakes arena where lives were won or lost in the brush. The beauty of the landscape was a cruel irony, a verdant mask for a system of oppression that was as cold and unyielding as the iron of a spear. Every tree in the royal domain became a potential hiding place for a crime, and every bush was a silent witness to the death of a soul. The sheer scale of the forests meant that the king's reach was vast, covering thousands of acres where no eye could see and no ear could hear the pleas of the hunted. The sovereign's will was a physical force that shaped the very geography of the woods, turning clearings into chambers and trails into traps. The 12th century was drawing to a close, but the darkness within the forest was only deepening as the machinery of the love hunt became more entrenched in the culture of the medieval aristocracy. The church's failure to intervene in this culture of predation was a source of deep internal shame for many of the more devout clergy, who felt the weight of their own impotence. They saw the noble families of their parishes being slowly corrupted by the king's sport, yet they were powerless to stop a monarch who claimed a divine right to rule his own lands as he saw fit. The spiritual health of the kingdom was being sacrificed on the altar of royal pleasure, and the forest was the temple where this sacrifice was performed. The holy water of the baptismal font could not wash away the stains acquired in the mud and leaves of the king's private hunting grounds. As the years progressed, the psychological divide between the forest and the city grew ever wider, creating a two-tiered reality for the inhabitants of the 12th century. In the villages and the cathedrals, the word of the priest was still the ultimate law, and the fear of hell kept the people in a state of relative order. But for the elite who rode with the king, the forest was a place of exemption, a magical and terrifying zone where the rules of civilization were suspended. This duality created a fragmented soul for the nobility, a state of being where they could be pious crusaders in the morning and ruthless predators by the afternoon. The forest itself seemed to adapt to its role as a political tool, its deep valleys and hidden streams providing the perfect settings for the various acts of the royal drama. The landscape was no longer a neutral entity, it was a character in the story of the Plantagenet reign, a silent partner that held the secrets of the dynasty in its roots. The wind whispering through the canopy was the only voice that could speak of the thousands of violations that had occurred in the name of the crown. The soil was enriched by the blood of the animals and the tears of the courtiers, creating a legacy of sorrow that would never be fully excavated by the historians of the future. In the final years of the century, the hunt for love had become so refined that it was almost indistinguishable from the daily business of the state. The king's itineraries were planned around the hunting seasons, and the political alliances of the kingdom were forged and broken amidst the barking of the hounds and the shouting of the beaters. The sovereign's hunger for possession had transformed the natural world into a mirror of his own insatiable ego, where every living thing was merely a resource to be consumed. The forest was the ultimate expression of the monarch's power, a green kingdom where he was the only god and the only law. The fear of the vestibule of hell was eventually replaced by a much more immediate and worldly fear of the king's displeasure. The nobility learned that it was safer to participate in the hunt and carry its secrets to the grave than to stand against the tide of royal desire. The church continued to write its treatises and deliver its sermons, but its voice was increasingly lost in the vastness of the woods. The power of the crown was anchored in the silence of the trees, and as long as the forest remained the king's personal domain, the hunt would continue to claim its trophies from the ranks of the high-born and the beautiful. This era of emerald shadows left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the European aristocracy, creating a culture of suspicion and hidden agendas that would persist for generations. The forest had taught the nobility that nothing was sacred and that power was the only absolute truth in an uncertain world. The lessons learned in the thickets were carried back to the courts and the battlefields, influencing the way that the leaders of the next century would view their subjects and their rivals. The hunt was not just a game, it was a school of ruthlessness that shaped the very nature of the medieval state and its governing philosophy. Ultimately, the forest of the 1200s was a place where the humanity of the subjects was stripped away to satisfy the vanity of the sovereign. It was a landscape of profound injustice, where the beauty of nature was weaponized against the weak and the vulnerable. The legacy of the hunt was a trail of broken promises and shattered lives that stretched across the continent, a narrative of power that ignored the pleas of the innocent and the warnings of the wise. The green halls of the king remained a monument to a time when the hunt for love was a hunt for the soul of a people, leaving behind only the echoes of a tragedy that refused to be forgotten. As the sun set on the final hunting season of the century, the forest stood as a dark and imposing boundary between the known world and the lawless realm of the crown. The hunters returned to their castles, their purses full of favors and their hearts heavy with secrets, while the woods remained in the darkness, waiting for the next season to begin. The silence was absolute, a heavy and suffocating weight that covered the land like a shroud. The hunt for love had reached its peak, and the price of that victory was a kingdom that had lost its moral compass in the deep, green heart of the royal forest. As the bells of the kingdom tolled for the passing of the 12th century in the year 1199, a somber realization began to settle over the stone-cold halls of power. The aging monarchs, who had spent their youth chasing phantoms in the deep brush, were now receding into the long shadows of history, leaving behind a realm that was far more fractured than any chronicle would dare to admit. Their departure was not just the end of a reign, but the closing of a brutal chapter that had defined the very essence of the Plantagenet era. Behind the grand funerals and the weeping of the paid mourners, the true face of the dynasty remained hidden in the dark, green depths of the ancient forests. In the wake of these dying kings, the landscape of Europe was littered with the invisible ghosts of 1,000 forgotten encounters. For decades, the royal hunt had been celebrated as the pinnacle of noble achievement, a vibrant display of strength and traditional skill. Yet, beneath the festive banners and the polished armor, there lay a darker inheritance that was only now beginning to surface as the new century approached. The true legacy of the 12th century was not found in the legal codes or the grand stone cathedrals, but in the silent faces of the children born from the violence of the woods. These were the survivors of a game that had been played with human lives. The most terrifying revelation of this departing era was the realization that the great dynasties, long considered the pillars of pure blood and divine right, were actually built upon foundations of filth and coercion. The noble lineages that boasted of their celestial origins were, in fact, rooted in the cold mud of forest ravines. Each branch of the family tree was grafted through acts of predatory aggression that took place during the wine-soaked battues of the king's youth. The purity that the heralds sang about was a fiction, a beautiful lie designed to obscure the reality that the next generation of rulers had been sown in the dirt during moments of drunken madness. By the year 1199, as the sun set on the final hunts of the Old Guard, a vast and nameless population of bastards had emerged from the shadows of the monasteries and foster homes. These were the children of the forest, the living proof of the royal appetite that had consumed the virtue of 100 noble houses. They stood at the edges of the courts, their eyes bearing the recognizable fire of the Plantagenet line, yet they were forever barred from the light of legitimacy. Their existence was a silent accusation against a system that treated the bodies of women as disposable trophies of a seasonal sport, meant to be forgotten once the leaves had fallen. The women who had been the targets of these hunts were not viewed as beloved muses or romantic interests in the eyes of the sovereign and his companions. To the king, they were merely another species of forest quarry, to be tracked with the same cold and calculating focus as the red deer or the wild boar. The language of chivalry, with its intricate codes of honor and its songs of devotion, was nothing more than a thin layer of gold leaf applied to a heavy and brutal machine of systematic violence. Beneath the gilding, there was only the raw mechanics of the chase and the eventual, inevitable cornering of the prey in a place where no one would hear their cries for mercy. In the deep ravines where the soil never feels the warmth of the sun, the memory of these encounters lingered like a persistent rot. The mothers of the king's unacknowledged heirs had been driven through the thickets like frightened animals, their silk gowns shredded by thorns and their dignity trampled under the hooves of the royal stallions. They were participants in a ritual that elevated the act of assault to a form of high art, a performance of power that left them broken and silenced. Their trauma was the fuel for the court's gaiety, a secret price paid to maintain the illusion of a vibrant and masculine monarchy that dominated both the land and its people. As the new century dawned, the shocking truth became impossible to ignore for those who lived in the wake of the royal train. The aristocrats who paraded their virtues in the cathedrals were the same men who had turned the hunt into a systematic industry of violation. The forest was their factory, and the tears of the women were the lubrication for the gears of their pleasure. The historical records would never name these victims, for they were written out of the narrative of progress and power. Instead, they were left in the darkness of the past, their lives reduced to a low murmur of injustice that would echo through the centuries without ever finding a resolution. The predatory nature of the hunt had become so deeply ingrained in the culture that it had poisoned the very concept of love for an entire generation of the elite. The affection described by the troubadours was a hollow mockery when compared to the reality of the forest clearings where the only emotion present was the thrill of the kill. Love had been redefined as a pursuit, a conquest that required the total annihilation of the other person's will. This psychological legacy was the most enduring gift of the 12th century, a dark inheritance that would shape the marriages and the politics of the 1300s with a cold and relentless cynicism that knew no bounds. Every drop of wine spilled on the forest floor and every silk ribbon left hanging on a branch was a monument to a life that had been diverted or destroyed. The land itself had absorbed the misery of the participants, the earth drinking the tears of the hunted just as it drank the blood of the slaughtered beasts. There was a terrible symmetry in the way the soil treated the human and the animal, showing no preference for the high-born lady over the common stag. In the eyes of the earth, they were both merely sources of moisture and minerals, consumed by the same cycles of growth and decay that ignored the grand pretenses of the royal court. The bitter irony of the era was that the very men who claimed to be the protectors of the weak were the ones who orchestrated their most profound betrayals. The knightly oaths of the 1190s were a hollow performance, a set of masks that were discarded as soon as the party entered the sovereign's private woods. The systematic nature of the violence meant that it was not an individual failure of character, but a collective failure of a culture that viewed power as its only god. The forest provided the sanctuary for this darkness to thrive, a green cathedral where the only sacrament was the satisfaction of the hunter's primal and unchecked desires. As the old kings died and were buried in their ornate stone sarcophagi, their secrets were supposed to be interred with them. But the blood of the forest continued to flow in the veins of the children who remained, a permanent and living reminder of the crimes committed in the name of the crown. The genealogies of the great houses were forever tainted by the muddy footprints of the hunt, a truth that would be whispered in the corners of the kingdom for 100 years. The past could not be washed away by the holy water of the church or the gold of the royal treasury, it was a permanent part of the landscape, as fixed as the roots of the ancient oaks. The final revelation was the scale of the indifference shown by the winners of this game toward the lives they had consumed. For the king and his favorites, the women were not individuals with souls and dreams, but momentary distractions in a life of endless war and political maneuvering. Once the season was over and the trophies were counted, the victims were cast aside like the bones of a feast, left to find their own way in a world that viewed them with suspicion and disdain. This coldness was the true engine of the dynasty, a detachment from human suffering that allowed for the building of empires and the destruction of thousands of innocent lives. The history of the 12th century, when viewed through the lens of the forest, is a narrative of profound and unredeemed suffering. The beauty of the tapestries and the complexity of the legal codes were just diversions from the truth of the muddy ravines and the terrified eyes of the pursued. The silence of the women was the foundation upon which the stability of the realm was built, a peace achieved through the systematic erasure of their voices and their agency. The forest was the witness to it all, a silent and unblinking observer that held the memories of the victims in its deep, dark heart, far beyond the reach of any human judge. In the end, the only thing that remained was a sense of profound bitterness and a low, guttering flame of anger that burned in the hearts of those who knew the truth. The hunt for love had concluded, but the damage it had inflicted on the soul of the kingdom would never be fully repaired. The trees stood as a dark and imposing boundary between the myths of the past and the cold realities of the future, their branches heavy with the weight of unrecorded history. The 12th century had ended, but its legacy was a trail of blood and tears that led straight into the heart of the next age, a path of injustice that would never be forgotten. The emotional reaction to this story is one of righteous fury, a response to a culture that celebrated the hunter while ignoring the agony of the prey. The realization that the very pillars of our civilization were built upon such acts of systematic cruelty is a shock that resonates through time, challenging our understanding of the past and its heroes. The forest remains, but the voices of the women are lost, replaced by the wind and the rustle of the leaves. We are left only with the bitterness of the knowledge that for some, the hunt never truly ended, and for others, the forest will always be a place of shadows and secrets that can never be told. The final image of the era is not a crown or a sword, but a small, muddy opening in the woods where the earth has been disturbed by the struggle of the weak against the strong. It is in this place that the true history of the Middle Ages was written, in the dirt and the damp, away from the eyes of the chroniclers. The kings have gone to their graves, and the castles have turned to ruin, but the rot of the forest remains, a permanent stain on the record of human achievement. The hunt for love was a tragedy of absolute power, a dark and unrelenting pursuit that left the world a colder and more cynical place for those who had to live in its long, green shadow.